Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm Tyler Alderson, your host today, talking about a really interesting guy, an Irishman who became the chief of police in Chicago. But that's not really why we're going to be talking about him. He also became one of the big figures in Irish traditional music in collecting tunes, in writing about various musicians, and about the music itself. And Michael O'Malley has written a book called The Beat Cop that discusses Francis O'Neill's life and legacy. Michael O'Malley is the professor of U.S. history at George Mason University. He joins me right now. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
So we talked. I just mentioned that he's an Irishman who's born in County Cork in 1865 and immigrates to the U.S. Becomes a cop. Can you give, beyond that, just a few kind of biographical sketch details of the life of Francis O'Neill?
Sure. It's kind of an astonishing life, really. He leaves Ireland at 17. He comes from a fairly affluent background. His family is not poor in Ireland, but half his siblings emigrate. They still have to leave Ireland because there's just not a lot there for him. He's a kind of bookish kid, but he's also got a sense of adventure. So his family wants him to be a priest, but he doesn't want to be a priest. And he can't even bring himself to explain that when he writes about it. But he leaves Ireland at 17. He's a cabin boy on a ship that sails to England, and then he becomes an itinerant seaman, which means he would just, wherever port he wound up in, he would wait for another ship, and they would looking for crew, and he'd say, "Yeah, I'm happy to go." So he goes as a sailor a lot of different places. He goes to Egypt, he goes to Russia, he goes to Japan. He sails around the world. Eventually, he gets shipwrecked on a desert island. It's a guano island where they mine bird droppings for fertilizer, and he gets shipwrecked there for 11 days and could literally have starved to death. Then he decides for a while to herd sheep in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, and he sleeps outdoors without a roof for 5 months. And then he goes back to sea for a little bit. Then he teaches school on the Missouri Prairie in a little town called Edina. Eventually he winds up in Chicago, and he gets jobs in packing houses and freight houses, and then he finally joins the police. And then there's a steady rise to chief of police, and he experiences some of the most momentous events in American urban history.
So this idea of the Irish cop is like one of the biggest cliches. And he's had all of these jobs. I mean, and he obviously stuck in the police department. Why is it that so many Irish immigrants ended up in police departments, especially? I mean, I'm from Massachusetts, so, the Boston Police Department, New York, Chicago, all those stereotypically Irish cops.
Philadelphia too. Yeah, where I'm from Philadelphia. Philadelphia police force was heavily Irish. Yeah. They arrived at the right time. So if you look at the colonial United States, there aren't any professional police forces. It's actually sort of interesting how law enforcement happens. It depends a lot on the kind of social rank of certain people. By the 1830s or 40s, though, cities are growing so quickly, they need to develop a professional, dedicated full-time police force rather than rounding up, deputizing some people as needs be. So they follow the English model, and in the maybe the 30s and through 50s, all the major American cities develop a professionalized police force based sort of on military lines. And the Irish are here at the right time to take advantage of that. In Chicago, the other big group is Germans. There's lots of Germans on the police force in Chicago. That's because there are a lot of German immigrants at the time. There's no special proclivity of the Irish for police. I think it just happens to be that they're there at the right time. And then they put a really sharp stamp on the culture of policing, for better or worse. O'Neill himself has very mixed feelings, I think, about being a cop.
And that stamp on the culture of policing gets into a little bit O'Neill's other passion, or really his, I guess, if he wasn't all that passionate about being a cop, his one passion, which is Irish music. And I even hear that he goes so far as to essentially hire people as cops who are musicians because he wants to get close to them, access to them, provide for
Yeah,
them and all that.
he does. He does. He's one of the interesting things for him is that in Cork, growing up in Cork, he probably never, was from a town really close to the town of Bantry, which is on the coast, southwest Cork. And he probably never went further than the city of Cork, which would be about as far as you could go in a day on horseback or in a carriage. So in Chicago, he meets people from every county in Ireland, and they're all pretty closely located. So he's able to hear things that he couldn't hear in Ireland. He had always loved music. And suddenly he's hearing all these unfamiliar tunes and people who can dance. He describes the police dancing in the station house. When, they have downtime in the station house, somebody will get out a flute or a fiddle and the police will be dancing in the station house. And then as he gains more authority in the police, as he rises up the ranks, he's able to exert enough influence to hire particularly good musicians. He can't just snap his fingers and make it happen. It was too complicated, but he could certainly exert a lot of influence. And when they found a good piper or a good fiddler, they would try to get that person a job. And there's several of his closest collaborators that he got jobs on the force.
So why is it that music took a hold of him at that point, or he found it so important? Because he's not the only one at this time in history as well that sees Irish music as a very particular in their vision of what Ireland is, what being Irish is.
Right. There's a long connection between Irish music and Irish nationalism, that Ireland is entitled to nationhood, distinct from England, partly because it has a distinctive culture, right? And its distinctive culture is expressed in music. So that was an old idea. What O'Neill did really differently was he focused very strongly on the dance music, the music of mostly at this point rural people, and it's mostly instrumental dance music. His first big collection, he does two big collections of tunes. And the first is 1850 tunes, and it includes slow airs, and it includes songs that were meant to be sung with lyrics. But what he's most famous for is his collection of the dance music of Ireland, which is 1,001 tunes, and that is only instrumental dance music. So he makes this decision to focus on this particular kind of music, which would have been the music he heard ordinary people dancing to at parties in Chicago. There's a really close connection, though, between, I think this is one of the unresolvable issues for the guy, between music as a kind of creative expression of freedom and the authority of being a cop. If you think about him as a sailor, on the one hand, a sailor is incredibly free. He goes with whatever ship he wants to go with, and he goes wherever the wind takes him. At this point, in O'Neill's day, it's actually still wind early on. But at sea, he's totally at the mercy of the authority of the captain, which is almost completely unchecked. And he writes about that the captain was a tyrant at sea, and whatever the captain said, you had to obey instantly. And if you didn't, there'd be physical abuse. So on the one hand, he's this footloose young guy. On the other hand, he's subject to the authority of the captain. And then he becomes a captain of police. And then he uses that police authority to collect this music. So there's a really interesting tension between kind of music as an expression of freedom and joyfulness or passion and, passion, sorrow, a mix of those things, and the regular, rational, steady work of police authority.
That's actually, I do want to just make a quick note that the time we're talking about, just for anyone unfamiliar with Irish history, Ireland was still fully part of the British Empire at this point, part of the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland.
Right.
It's
right. I should say he leaves Ireland in 1865, right, and then he's chief of police by 1900. So that's roughly the time frame we're talking about.
And that's very important in terms of a time in Irish history. Certainly the turn of the century up through the next couple of decades sees a huge rise in Irish nationalist interest, and also a huge rise in the kind of cultural interest and revival of the Irish language, music, dance, so on and so forth. One of the things that I find just as interesting as the stuff that O'Neill collects is the stuff that he either doesn't include
Doesn't collect.
or he actively disparages in some cases that has that national element. Can you just sort of describe
Yeah.
the tunes and the instruments that he sort of studiously ignored, if not denigrated?
Right. Right, he did. Ireland has a really rich musical heritage. It's very distinctive, and you can recognize an Irishy sounding tune, right? Most people can. He was very interested in kind of purifying that tradition. So when he gets to America, there are lots of Irish. There are more Irish people in America than there are in Ireland for most of his life in the States, and they're playing music that inevitably gets inflected by American commercial culture. So there'd be minstrel show tunes or tunes that are performed on the stage and are kind of more stagey. And then there are a huge tradition of deeply political songs about the famine, songs about British tyranny, songs about aspirations for Irish freedom. And Irish freedom is a very turbulent subject. And in Chicago can get you killed. Irish nationalist politics can be very violent, and it's very factionalized. And so I think for him, the part of the music reason he focuses on the music he does is he can pitch it as apolitical or not factional. It's cultural politics, not explicit politics. It's cultural nationalism, not explicit political nationalism. And he's very influenced by that in an outfit called the Gaelic League, which is typical of 19th century nationalist movements, in that it argues the path to Irish independence is not through politics, it's through reinvigoration of the Irish language and Irish literature and Irish music and Irish sports and Irish dancing. And that's led by a guy named Douglas Hyde, who O'Neill very much admires. He's drawn towards this vision of cultural nationalism, and he never publicly commits to what he wants in terms of politics. He's very quiet on that issue.
And he also, I understand, kind of rejected certain instruments as well. That ones that are seen as today extremely traditional, like the accordion and the concertina, at the heart of the tradition. That's some people would say, and yet at that time, I guess they weren't seen as part of that pure vision.
It's actually kind of odd. He only has ears for the flute, the fiddle, and the pipes. Those are really the only, maybe the whistle. He refers to the tin whistle as a flute, which I guess technically it is. But so the flute or the whistle, the pipes, and the fiddle are the only instruments he recognizes. And even in his day, the accordion was being pretty widely used. There's so many variations on the accordion in so many cultures, and it's being played. In fact, some of the first recordings of Irish music in America are by a German guy, John Kimmel, playing a keyed accordion. And O'Neill knew about those. And the mandolin, people are playing mandolins in Irish music, and he knows about that too, but he has no interest in that. And I think he doesn't want to know about the banjo, because the banjo is heavily associated at this point with the minstrel show. Banjo is the instrument at this point of white people imitating black people in blackface. That's where most people hear a banjo for the first time. The banjo undergoes this fascinating shift in the 20th century where it becomes the instrument of sort of white folk authenticity, and people associate the banjo with the Appalachian Hills. But in 1830, as opposed to 1930, everybody understood the banjo as an instrument from Africa, played by Africans. And in the minstrel show, where white Americans were routinely parodying black people, there were big banjo choruses. So when the banjo appears in Irish music, O'Neill would have been aware of that as a kind of corruption. And he was not a bigot personally, and not inclined to the kind of common racial mockery that you see in other writing at the time. And I think it felt a little distasteful to him and also a little impure.
You just set me up so perfectly. So I do want to say that we have a podcast episode about the history of the banjo and about the exact dynamics that you just talked about, actually with me as the person being interviewed, because that's a subject that I've
That's a great subject.
done a lot of. I'm a banjo player myself, and I've done a lot of research.
It's a fascinating
on that.
history.
So I just need to shout that out right now. Go back and listen to it, everybody listening to this, if you haven't already. But it's a really interesting concept that we have coming from O'Neill then, because of the fact that on the one hand, he's this fantastic source for a lot of the music of the time. On the other hand, we need to balance, what he says with what we know were his proclivities. And I wanted to know, you've in terms of the actual, I guess, the influence and the mistakes that you can make in interpreting, what he writes. How can we read O'Neill, and how have people read O'Neill and his, compilations?
He writes a lot. He's very prolific, and he's also famous not just for the collections, but for two big histories of Irish music. One is called Irish Folk Music: A Fascinating Hobby, and the other is called Irish Minstrels and Musicians. And they're pretty impressive accomplishments. He interviewed people, he dug up information, he went back to Ireland for the first and only time in his life, and spent about a month and a half over there finding information on musicians. And it's quite a valuable resource. But almost all that we have about O'Neill is his own words. And it's just the grossest kind of historical malpractice to take anybody's words at face value. You just would never do that. I mean, I'm not saying he's dishonest. I don't think he is. But you would never accept someone's self-representation as the unvarnished truth. He has a great style. He writes in a humorous, dry, kind of ironic style. He doesn't brag, but he's very terse and emotionally withholding. You'd never know that 10 of his children, he had 10 children, 6 of them died. You'd never know that from his writing, or he never expresses the pain of that loss, except in very fleeting moments. That controlling part, I think, is important. And I think it's part of the tension between him being a police officer and a lover and collector of the pre-industrial folk music of peasants. I mean, it's a really interesting tension. He's a little hazy on the degree to which he was anti-union. He was very anti-union. He made a decision, I think, in Chicago that he wasn't going to side with the political aldermen who were routinely attacked for being corrupt, and he wasn't going to side with unions. He was going to side with business. And he says this several times, that when his career is threatened by one thing or another, that the endorsement of the city's business elite saved him. And that must have been a difficult decision, because who are the union members if he's helping to break up a strike? They're going to be Irish immigrants. They're going to be the people playing the music that he loves. And it puts him at some odds with that community. He also, we should be aware of what he omitted. And he's not, well, the comparison I make in the book is that he's sort of like anthropologists who collected Native American artifacts. The Native Americans had no desire to have their artifacts collected. They felt no need for it. They weren't doing it. They weren't in a system of thinking about the world that imagined their artifacts as collectible objects. So archaeologists go to the plains, or they go to the Southwest, and they collect Navajo pottery or remains. They collect Indian remains, and they take them back to the Smithsonian, and they put them in a museum. That's a really culturally violent act. And of course, it's on the one hand great that those artifacts are preserved, but great for who? The Native people didn't necessarily feel any desire for this. And one of the things O'Neill complained about all the time was that musicians didn't want to share their tunes. He'd hear a new tune and he'd be all excited about it. And he'd say, play that again, play that again. And they wouldn't do it because they wanted to keep the tune to themselves. They understood the tune as belonging to their family or themselves or their community or their townland back in Ireland. And so he would use the authority of the badge. That's the phrase that he used to help facilitate his collections. And that meant sometimes intimidating people in his uniform, using his lieutenants or his sergeants or his patrolmen to go and collect tunes surreptitiously, sometimes bribing people, coercing people by giving them jobs on the force. There's an element of colonialism at work. I think the way anybody would look at the collections of Native artifacts, we can look at O'Neill that way. That was a really long answer.
No, and it's interesting because that also tracks with I did a master's on my research was on music in the traveling community in Ireland, and that
very similar
hiding of the tunes because essentially you didn't want another piper to take your signature tune as well as that
Right.
kind of coercive collection is
Right.
again a huge factor in a lot of
Yes.
that, which
And it's too simple to just condemn him, because the value of those collections has been proved over and over for decades, the value of O'Neill's collection. So I don't want to simply condemn it, but what I want to point out is how the notion of Irish traditional music is formed out of these power relationships. I mean, he is an agent of the state in Chicago, in the uniform of the state, exercising the coercive power of the state. And if you like, the fact that the police represent the state's monopoly on legitimate use of violence. I'm not saying he did beat people up, but not musicians necessarily. But there's an element of coercion or even kind of intellectual violence in the collection. And there are times when he's bluntly dismissive of musicians who don't have anything to offer him, like they have no new tunes. And so he just not interested in them at all. It's a kind of instrumental rationality that's ruthless.
That goes to a sort of a broader point about, I guess, the field that I come from which is ethnomusicology, which is still in its very early stages at this point. But he nowadays, would be considered somebody who would be called an ethnomusicologist, and certainly went about his collecting in a way that's very familiar.
Yes, that's right.
And it also goes to this sense of what folk music and what the study of folk music means. And you've talked a little bit about that in your discussion of, likening it to, people collecting artifacts.
Right.
This is a tradition, this is a music that is just the party music and the local music of the people.
Yeah.
And it's really O'Neill and people like him who turn that music into a cohesive sense of genre. What was the actual, what do we know about the actual sort of day-to-day relationship people had with Irish music at the time, the scene there, and then also how they envisioned it and how O'Neill envisioned it as sort of belonging to the Irish culture?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a lot of Irish people, I think, come to America and they don't really know anything about Ireland. I mean, they may have stories about Cuchulainn or something, but they don't. So you get off the boat from Roscommon, let's say, or Donegal, and you wind up in Chicago, and you go to the theater and they're presenting something Irish, or you go to the World's Fair in 1893 and there's a recreated Irish village. There's two of them actually in 1893, and they both have fake castles that are 3/4 the size of the original, and they both have thatched cottages, and they have comely maidens weaving and turf fires burning, and like one of them is Blarney Castle. Now, what did a guy from Donegal know about Blarney Castle? I think nothing, probably nothing. It wasn't part of his growing up. He never would have seen it. But in America, Blarney Castle, that's a thing. We do this. We're Irish. It's a thing. They get a sense of themselves that's a kind of meta sense, right? That's different from the sense they might have had in Ireland. And that includes performative Irishness, performing Irishness on stage. There's all sorts of controversy about what's called the stage Irishman in the 19th century, who has chin whiskers and his red hair and, the knee breeches, and carries a shillelagh, and he's usually bumbling and he messes up the language. And it's very much, if you analyze how Paddy, the stage Irishman, what Paddy does, it's very similar to what Sambo, the stage Negro, does. That's the same role, bumbling, malapropisms, don't quite get the modern world, stumbling comedy. They're very similar characters. So there's this kind of Irishness, which Irish people laugh at it. I mean, George M. Cohan starts as the Cohan family, the Stars and Stripes, that's not Star, what is it? I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy guy, starts out performing as a stage Irishman in a family that does stage Irishman. But if you ask them to, they'll do a minstrel show just as easily, and they'll use the same jokes. They'll just change the dialect. from Negro or Black to Irish. So O'Neill wants to identify a kind of Irishness that's distinct from that. I think he's troubled by it. He's troubled by its kind of impurity and by the hybridity of it. And there are Irish people in Chicago who play the traditional dance tunes, the ones they would have learned at dances back in the old country. And of course, they're still coming over all throughout his career in Chicago. There's still lots of Irish people coming over and bringing new tunes with them. It's clear there's a practice in Chicago of house dances, as there would be on the south side of Chicago when Black people come up from Mississippi. There are house dances or rent parties where people get together to play and dance informally, people who don't have a lot of money. He describes gatherings at other people's houses, but there's also a culture of dance halls and saloons. He finds one of his big collaborators, Barney Delaney, playing in a saloon, in a cheap public house, he says. I found him playing in a cheap public house. So there were several levels of, and I elevated him. He's very bitter about Barney Delaney, that he was trying to distinguish, I guess, a commercialized version of Irish culture from what he could see as a non-commercial version of Irish culture. And that's typical of the folk music movement in general, which wants to find its subject as far from commerce as possible.
Which
is that fair to say? That's
yes,
right?
which is also funny, given the industry of Irish music as it stands right now. I mean, right. And not just actually as it stands right now, but even much closer to O'Neill's time, the big recordings that everyone points to. Coleman and John
Coleman.
McKenna and all those were commercially made recordings, which is no, go on.
The Irish people Irish people don't have their head on straight about this. So O'Neill at one point, he's at the Chicago World's Fair. No, they really don't. I mean, and I feel I could say this. They don't. They don't know what they think about those Coleman records, because half the time they'll tell you. So in the 1920s, Irish Americans started making records of Irish music, maybe World War I, 1920s. And those are really, really enthusiastically received in Ireland. And they're sometimes described as a revelation. Michael Coleman was so good. People would put the fiddle down and never touch it again because Coleman was so good. They'll tell you that. And then they'll tell you, oh, it was just like he played back in Sligo before he left. It was both totally unique and exactly the same. And those are contradictory positions, right? So what I think O'Neill, at one point, O'Neill is at the Chicago World's Fair, which is held, this is a huge deal in America, the 1893 Columbian Exposition. 40% of the population of the United States goes to that fair. It's a huge deal. And O'Neill's watching, he's at one of the recreated Irish villages, and he hears two pipers. And one is a guy named Turlough McSweeney, or he sometimes uses the Irish pronunciation, which I won't attempt. And he hears McSweeney, who's right over from Donegal. And then he hears a guy named Patsy Toohey, who left Ireland when he was 3 years old and was a professional vaudevillian. And Toohey had an act, a comedy act. Sometimes he danced with his wife. Sometimes he performed in Harrigan's Double Hibernian Players. And they did a whole shtick where they would drive around town in a jaunting cart, one of those quiet man carts that they drive. And he's a professional Irishman. That is, he performs Irishness on the vaudeville stage, where his audience is going to be Irish, German, Italian, Chinese, African-American, native white. It's going to be a mixed audience. And he has to devise a style that can seize those people, grab them by the lapels, get them to pay attention and capture their interest, or else he's not going to have a career on vaudeville. And O'Neill watches these two pipers and he says, clearly Toohey is the one. Toohey is the better player. Toohey represents modern Ireland. In other words, what he's choosing here is the performed Irishness, not the other guy who's much more. Turlough McSweeney or McSuvna was full of folklore about the fairies, and he claimed the fairies had blessed him with the gift of music one night on a rath in a stone circle. All this, you would think he would pick that guy as the model of authenticity, but he picks Toohey. Toohey is a virtuoso. He's a dazzling player. Why? Because he's playing 3 sets a day, on the vaudeville stage, touring around the country, playing to people who couldn't care less about Ireland. for the large part. That is, it's performed. And I think that's also Coleman. It was performed. And then that gets back to Ireland. And I think it's a revelation in Ireland because it was their folk music. It's never popular music in Ireland, really. I mean, Irish people at every stage listen to the same things that people in England listen to. They didn't only listen to Irish traditional music. And it was always kind of minority music. And it was always looked down on by snooty middle-class people. And it was a revelation, I think, to hear it with the polish and the performative verve that a professional stage performer could bring. I mean, it was great to have the guy who played your local dances, and those are wonderful players, yes, and honor those players. But what they heard in the American records was something different. And O'Neill is trying to split that difference between performative Irishness and authentic folk Irishness.
And another thing that he has at his fingertips that you've alluded to multiple times, he has people from Donegal, he has people from Dublin, from Mayo, from all Tipperary and Kerry and all the rest. I mean, no one at the time in Ireland had necessarily the access to the geographical range that someone in at their finger. You could go from Cork to Donegal, but it'll take you a little while to get there.
Right, and roads aren't good, and right.
You could,
but he can take the L. He's in Chicago. He can take the L. There's cabs. There's he can go easily, or he sends his lieutenants out there. He'll send his sergeant out there. I mean, they would literally come to him. We hear there's a guy in the stockyards who's got a bunch of tunes, and is okay. Get those tunes, all right. Bring me to him, and I'll meet him. His closest collaborator for a long time was from Belfast fiddler. And when would he have James O'Neill? No relation. But when would he have run into James O'Neill in Ireland? He wouldn't. But in Chicago, the density of the population is also a revelation. And I think in Irish history, it's not enough attention is paid to the fact that he's the chief of police. He's a police administrator, which means he's engaged in a massive project of social surveillance and rational administration. He's got to be, by the time he's a captain, he's got a whole district and he's getting daily reports from all his patrolmen, and he's got to write those up. And then when he's chief, he's got to give annual reports, and he's summarizing long chains of statistics about who's committing what kind of robberies or what kind of crimes, and are they recidivists? Are they repeaters or are they new? What ethnicities commit what crimes? What neighborhoods? He has to give reports on all that. It's a massive job of administrative rationality, and he's able to imagine this bird's eye view of America. That's what Eileen Dillon, as an Irish scholar, calls it, a bird's eye view of Irish music, because he has this position as an administrator. It's very similar to the view he's trying to get as chief of police.
You've mentioned a few times the kind of ethical, and certainly nowadays in the past few years there's been a lot of examination of the power structures of policing. Just like he kind of, I don't want to say polishes, but he creates a certain image of Irish music. He has had this kind of romantic image of himself in how musicians today view him, and I think most musicians, like myself, come through him with the 1,001 Irish tunes. And if you go on YouTube, you can find a bunch of musicians who will go through each one. They'll play a tune a day out of O'Neill's Irish 1,001 Irish tunes, and play them all.
Right.
What kind of legacy does he have, and how do others coming after him? Sometimes, I mean, we're now a century after him. How do others sort of use his scholarship, and also perhaps change how this kind of narrative of his life, certainly maybe diminishing some of those coercive elements?
Well, his description of himself was consistently that he was a basically honest man in a corrupt world and trying to do his best. And that's kind of true, but aren't we all? Right, aren't we all? But Chicago was incredibly corrupt and incredibly violent. It's really, even in the United States at a time when political corruption was held to be rampant, Chicago was notorious. And you could not get any job in Chicago without putting together a kind of team of aldermen and judges and local officials who would advocate for you. And at the same time, a different team was advocating for some other person. And O'Neill was frustrated that there was no sort of objective merit. There was no objective criteria for advancement. At every stage, his advancement depended on patrons, and he becomes the political client of Carter Harrison II, who appoints him to chief of police. So he depicts himself as a virtuous man in a corrupt world. And of course, right, we all would like to believe that about ourselves. But there again, why would we accept at face value his claims about himself? The thing that there are several points in his Irish folk music, a fascinating hobby, where he's fairly brutal to people in the Irish music community who don't have anything to offer. There's a man named Murphy he describes. It's actually, if you look at this in the book, which you can find at Google Books, it's quite appalling. Murphy is a blind man or nearly blind man, somewhat mentally disabled, and he's a Civil War veteran. And he runs a little store, which is actually just a shebeen. It's got illegal whiskey in it. And he plays the pipes, but he's absolutely terrible on the pipes. He's terrible. But he's crazy, and he thinks he can play. So O'Neill several times describes how the police will mock this guy. Like they'll go to his house, the police in their uniforms, and they'll say, play us a tune. And then they'll dance and they'll make fun of him and they'll laugh at him. And he describes this at least 3 times where cops and aldermen do this to Murphy. And, you look at it now, he's a blind, mentally disabled veteran of the Civil War. And the police are treating him like this object of mockery. And there's an element of cruelty there that I think was an unfortunate side effect of the structure of policing. And he is, several times O'Neill was openly defended what was torture. He defends the practice the Chicago police had called the stomach pump, which is very similar to waterboarding, where they'd hold a guy down face up and force water down his throat. In this case, they'd force it into his stomach till his stomach was bloated, and then they'd punch him in the stomach and force the water out. Or they do, and he defends this to the Chicago City Council, and he defends it in the newspaper. And they also have something they called the sweat box, where they put somebody in isolation. And I don't know that he liked torture. I don't think he was fond of it. He complains that the job of a policeman was somewhat morally degrading, that it was rough and coarse and exposed people to the worst sides of human life. But he does defend it. And you could say, to the degree that Chicago police have a reputation for abuse, and they certainly did in the last couple decades, O'Neill helped set that.
And that gets to this tension, and this is going very wide range, but I find it so fascinating with Irish music in particular. On the one hand, we have colonization by Britain, and there were certainly oppression and times when the language and the culture were being oppressed and erased. And so there's always this Irish sense of, underdog and, fight the man and colonialism. Right. And yet here we have, O'Neill who did such is someone who people go back to time and time again in Irish music, who's engaged in some really appalling practices and really the kind of foundational practices to the kinds of power structures that we still see here in in America and in terms of those power inequities.
Yeah, I don't want to depict him as a really bad person. I don't think he was. I think he was trying to be the best person he could be. He was in a very brutal time. I mean, Chicago is a great city, dynamic, exciting, innovative, great place to live. Also absolutely horrible. It stank. There are decaying cattle corpses in the river, which bubbles and foams. There's sewage in the water. It's full of crime. It's also a terrible place. He's trying to negotiate that, and he's trying to find a way to be decent. In the police force, that one of his lieutenants, he names him as assistant chief, a guy named Herman Schutler, was much worse as a proponent of torture, aggressively talking about how he was going to torture people. So O'Neill is walking something of a balancing act. He is part of a power structure that's, in the name of order, imposing a lot of things on the communities that they police. He speaks very warmly about his community, about his friends in the Irish American community, but all those relationships tended to break down as he rose up in the force. And of course, that's partly like in the army, the colonel can't be friends with the enlisted people, but that would be somewhat inevitable. But I think it put him at odds with his community. There's a very interesting story where he's like a progressive reformer. He goes to visit, he's heard this guy coincidentally named O'Malley is a good fiddle player, and he goes to O'Malley's rickety apartment in a rough neighborhood, and they go up the back stairs, and O'Malley is there, and the family is very, very uncomfortable, he says, because here's the captain of police in his uniform, and no good can come of that. I mean, they know that from Ireland, that this is only going to be trouble for them. So O'Neill produces some coins, and some beer appears, and they relax a little bit. And then this guy O'Malley starts playing, and he's missing a finger from his left hand, but he plays. His rapid but correct execution was astonishing, O'Neill said. So he spends a few hours with O'Malley listening. O'Malley, he said, eked out a living playing house dances in the Irish community. He never bothers to learn the guy's first name. He never bothers to ask how he came to be missing a fiddle on his left hand, which a fiddler would need. Was it an industrial accident? He doesn't care. He doesn't care about the house dances. O'Malley doesn't have any new tunes, and so that's the last you hear of him. And that is a kind of distance that I think most, say, ethnomusicologists now would look at with some criticism, with a critical eye. He's not at all empathetic to that guy, and because he has nothing to offer. He doesn't have any new tunes. And so off they go. Did that answer? I'm not sure.
That kind of that power dynamic is something that is very interesting to me, and it goes into, again, the ways in which O'Neill and people like him shaped the way that we think about Irish music, even if we don't necessarily think about it. I mean, 1,001 Irish tunes. Geez, that's a lot. That must be comprehensive. But of course, there's always the omissions, right, and there's always
I mean, if you think about the Indian artifacts, maybe I can't speak for Native Americans. I'm not an expert, but you could imagine that the artifacts don't have value as artifacts. They only have value embedded in cultural practices. And you could imagine the actual heart of Irish music is not the tune, it's the communal practice of the tune, right? It's meeting, sharing tunes, playing tunes together, dancing. It's the community practice. That's the essence of it. But what he's doing is alienating those tunes from community, putting them in a collection, and then defining that collection as the essence of Irish music and central to Irish culture. Again, I don't want to say it's not valuable. It's obviously very valuable, and its value has been proven over and over. All I want to point out is some of the power dynamics that were inherent in that practice, and they were really typical of late 19th century America. They're part of Weberian rationality and the information revolution and the managerial revolution. So the collection of Irish music is embedded in those changes in ways that often gets overlooked. You see this now in Irish music, which on the one hand, Irish traditional music, which on the one hand is celebrated as a social experience, and the other hand is a kind of canon of tunes that you have to learn and memorize.
Well, I was going to say, and also is codified, with cultus and with with the competitions and with some very, very well-known, high-grossing acts, the Dubliners, Chieftains,
yes.
Right. You have these touring groups. You've got things like Riverdance that kind of spin off of all of that.
And then you get, of course, into the politics of authenticity and what's authentic and what's not, and who gets to decide. And that's a really fraught subject and a really interesting subject. And it's particularly interesting if you're, writing from as an Irish American, for example, where the authenticity lies there. But O'Neill would say, and did say in 1906, that there was more and better music in any dance hall in Chicago than in all of Ireland. He felt like the music had actually moved. Its location had moved. I don't think he's right about that, but he said that.
I think of the Italian restaurants that, like there's one down the street, they
Yeah.
do spaghetti and meatballs. Now, everyone says, well, spaghetti
Yeah.
and meatballs doesn't exist in Italy. You'd have your meatballs, you have your spaghetti.
Right.
And I'm
Right.
not Italian, so
Right.
I don't know the particulars. But, you get the hyphen American attached to a lot of practices, Irish American, Italian American, Greek American, so on and so forth. I wanted to know, I guess, O'Neill seems to kind of sidestep a lot of that he seems to want
Yes.
to just talk about Irishness, despite the fact that so much of what he does is done in an American context.
Yes, right. He doesn't use if you look at almost any of his contemporaries who are interested in music, they'll use much more heavily racialized language. They'll talk about he does talk about the natural genius of the Irish race, as if the music is a racial essence that only Irish people can play. But he's also, as I think most musicians are, keenly aware that it takes tons of practice. It's not, you're not lapping this up off the dew. It takes a lot of work. And he's much less strident in that language than a lot of his contemporaries. So he's got some room for the idea that Irish music is available to anyone who wants to embrace it. But he's enmeshed in a culture which is very concerned with this is one of his most interesting correspondences is with a guy named Henry Mercer, who's a anthropologist, archaeologist, and antiquarian from Philadelphia. Mercer's from a wealthy family, and he's obsessed with pre-industrial culture. And he goes around the East Coast, all up and down the East Coast mostly, collecting artifacts of pre-industrial culture. And he builds a museum in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, which is definitely worth seeing. It's very bizarre. It's very strange. But he collects, there's a stagecoach and a cider press and a whaleboat and a corn shucking machine and a cigar store punch figure. It's just miscellaneous collections of every craft you can imagine. And Mercer's argument was that the genius of a nation was found not in its political leaders or its political philosophy, but in the creativity of its artisans. And Mercer was just as interested in women's artistry as he was in men's, and he was just as interested in Native American crafts as he was in European crafts. And he made no distinction really about, sometimes he did, but O'Neill was, I think, drawn to that. And towards the end of his life, he was thinking of music less as Irish and more as pre-industrial folk, right? He was finding a different frame to think about it, that there's a realm of culture where Irish music, Appalachian Hill music, Scottish music, English music, French music, they're all designed to have poor people with relatively few resources make it possible to have a dance. And that's a shared need or a shared necessity. And he gets more interested in that later in his life. So he moves away a little bit from the strong Irish emphasis. I think the obvious answer is that he doesn't know he's Irish until he's in America, like a lot of people. He says he couldn't get out of Ireland fast enough when he was 17. There were no jobs. His brother was sort of oppressive, and he couldn't inherit the family farm. It was either work for wages for his brother or be a priest, and he didn't want either one of those things. He said, my only objective was to get out of Ireland as soon as possible by any means. And in America, though, he becomes more Irish. And he becomes more Irish in this context of presented Irishness, right? Irishness performed, Irishness synthesized out of all the different counties. And he's part of that.
And that's something as an Irish American, I'm sure you connect to. And I find it very interesting as someone who, as far as I am aware, has no Irish heritage whatsoever.
Yeah.
But we both kind of connected because of actually an online forum discussing Irish music. Yeah. And I did want to ask, I mean, you are somebody who also, has an interest in the music and are a musician. I'm staring at you right now, not necessarily trad instruments behind you, but you've got some guitars behind you in your study. And you're holding up a flute now.
I got a flute. Yeah.
Who made your flute, out of curiosity?
A guy named Jeffrey Ellis,
Oh
who's
yeah,
in the
yeah,
Pacific
yeah, yeah.
Northwest. Lawmaker in the Pacific Northwest.
I've heard.
I have an Olwell flute on order.
Oh wow.
Too.
Oh geez. For anyone who doesn't know
Yeah.
Irish flutes, that is like the Cadillac, the Rolls Royce
The Cadillac,
of Irish flutes.
Right.
But I wanted to ask you,
I would say,
as a musician,
yeah. I regard myself as an American, and my family's very strongly identified as Irish American, and Irish Americans marrying Irish Americans. But I didn't particularly like Irish music, and I wasn't interested as a historian in Irish subjects. I found the sentimentality of Irish American culture really off-putting, the apolitical sentimentality, and also the kind of reactionary politics. We suffered, therefore other people should shut up. There's a certain element of reactionary politics that I never liked, and I was surprised to find myself interested. One of my brothers was always making fun of me for being interested in Irish jigs, but I didn't think I could write about the music unless I understood how it operated. I had been a musician, I'd been a student of jazz and blues, and had gigged around DC very, very semi-professionally. I didn't think I could write about it without having some sort of more basic understanding of it. And so I became a student of the music and have learned to play, not particularly well, but with great sincerity, a few dozen tunes, and go to a session where they'll tolerate me if I don't overdo it. So I think of it as also part of my interest in this was engaging with what the past meant in terms of family history. This is the book I'm working on now is about that. But I like to think of music as a practice that's available to anyone. It's a practice. You're engaging in a culture and you're practicing it. You're not trying to be it. If I study Afro-Cuban music, which I have, I'm not trying to be Afro-Cuban, right? I'm trying to practice this style of music. And I think of it as maybe one way to look at what O'Neill did is that it opens it up as a practice that anybody can take part in by defining it so strictly.
Right. And now, of course, we have Irish music is where you can go to Japan and go to an Irish session.
Irish session, right? Yeah, it's very globalized and it's very robust online. And of course, it's minority music. The Irish. I'm in Ireland. They're listening to Ed Sheeran and Beyonce. They're not necessarily. It's not like it's. But there's a robust community of people interested in Irish music. I guess that's what I'd say. Just as there's a robust community of people interested in American folk music or old time music or bluegrass.
And Francis O'Neill certainly had a huge influence, not only because I think there are probably plenty of people whose introduction to Irish music or the way that they build their repertoire comes from
yes,
picking up one of his books.
Yeah, lots of times people play it differently than in the books. You look at his version of Banished Misfortune, for example, which is a tune a lot of people play. It's a jig, and it's very different. Well, it's not very different. There's significant differences, and the music has sort of moved on from that in some ways. Lots of people comment on that, how O'Neill's versions are different, and also they're not. I found this when I started trying to learn it. They're almost useless unless you've already studied the idiom of Irish music. As just notes on the page, they don't make any sense. They're flat, they're dead. They don't, until you sort of understand the idiom a little bit, they aren't much help to you. That's what I found.
That gets to, again, this point of if you're studying music, how best to do that. And a lot of times you will see people notating music that was never notated.
Right.
Notation, in Irish music, because people always say it was never, no one ever sort of used notation, but it was used as a kind of a mnemonic device, at best.
Right.
You might write it down, but you had to have the tune in your head. And that kind of shifting onto the page becomes, an interesting.
Yeah. It's the tension now, I find, is that you want to learn a tune and maybe I want to play it at a local Irish music session. If people don't know, there are these Irish music sessions typically in pubs or Irish bars, and people gather and they play tunes. And it's not like jazz where you play the head and then everybody takes a solo. It's everybody knows the tune and they play the tune. And for that to work, you have to not just know what tunes they're going to play, you have to know the version of the tune they're going to play. Or you have to be able to adapt on the fly to the version that's prevailing in the room. And so when you're learning a tune, you confront this problem of what's the real tune? Like what's the canonical version of this tune? And you'll go online and you'll find, on thesession.org, you'll find sometimes 12 or 16 different versions of the tune.
And no, go ahead.
Well, so O'Neill sets up this problem. He sets up a canonical version. And the practice of the music, though, is actually much more slippery and maybe better or maybe more frustrating, depending on how you look at it. And it's a kind of living folk practice. And even today, it's in tension with the impulse to standardize.
I think there's so many avenues that I'd love to explore, but we only have so much time, and I don't want to take up more of yours. So I'll say that anyone who wants to learn more about this, first of all, as you said, I mean, O'Neill wrote this stuff way back when. It's completely out of copyright. So if you search Francis O'Neill, there's copies and stuff online. But more importantly, The Beat Cop, University of Chicago Press. By the way, great play on words, Beat Cop, and
Thank you.
Music. That's excellent. I love a good pun and a title.
Yeah.
The Beat Cop is available now. A fascinating life and some really fascinating issues that Francis O'Neill's life and work end up bringing up. Michael O'Malley is a professor of U.S. history at George Mason University. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much, Tyler. It was a pleasure.
And you've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. We will see you in a couple weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.